This conference will now be recorded.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Strategies for Becoming the Go-To Source for 2020 Election Coverage. This is the third webinar in the America East News Media Summit webinar series. My name is Mary Firestone, and I am the Manager of Meetings and Member Services for the Pennsylvania NewsMedia Association. The PNA has organized a series of complimentary webinars that will feature much of the content scheduled for the live America East Summit that was canceled earlier this year due to the coronavirus pandemic. Today's session will be recorded, and we will be sharing a link to that recording and a follow-up communication early next week. In today's session, Dr. Matthew Reavy, professor at the University of Scranton, Brad Bumsted, Bureau Chief at the Caucus, and Bernie Oravec, publisher of Barash Media and State College, will be focusing on how you and the publications you work for can produce invaluable content for local, state, and national races. The webinar will begin with our speakers presenting their information, and will then open up for a question and answer session that will include questions developed from information provided by attendees prior to the webinar, as well as questions received in the webinar chat. You can find the chat in the upper right side of your GoToMeeting window with the chat bubble icon. Thank you again for attending, and we will begin with Dr. Matt Reavy.
I'm just looking, I don't have the ability to share my screen yet. Oh, there we go, okay. Okay, as said, my name is Matt Reavy from the University of Scranton. I will be talking today about an area of research that I'm interested in, which is polling, to try to give some tips for how to interpret polls and what to think about polls. When we're thinking about polling in this particular election, we're looking back, of course, at the 2016 polling and everyone talking about how did we get it so wrong? Like, what was wrong with the polls in 2016? We did a debriefing about what happened, what went wrong, and it turns out we're worried about it continuing forward. The pollsters were worried about how bad they got it in 2016, and now they're saying, can we trust them moving forward into 2020? The fact of the matter is, though, if you look back at the 2016 election, pollsters did a pretty good job. You can see here what the actual poll results were. 48.2 to 46.1. The final polling results were not that far off. In terms of the national poll, that's one of the problems of relying on these national polls. They're not going to necessarily tell you who wins the election. They're going to tell you who gets the most votes, perhaps. But you can see that this particular poll was within 2 points. And in fact, that's about the average error that we see in polling moving forward into elections, roughly about 2 points. When we want to look at polls, a great way to look at polls is look at this average. This is, for example, the Real Clear Politics average of polls. In the aggregate, polls are pretty good. They tend to be pretty spot on, even now, and that still amazes me because we've gone through such technological change. I'm surprised that polls and pollsters are able to be as accurate as they are today. Now, a couple of things that we want to think about when we're looking at polls. First thing I always talk about is sampling error. So sampling error, when you look at a poll, for example, this is from CNBC, they're talking about the battleground states, and they're saying that Joe Biden is leading in the battleground states by 3 points, 48 to 45, and that includes Pennsylvania, of course. Note that they talk about sampling error, or they talk about the margin of error. In this particular case, the margin of error is 1.94%. I don't want to throw out lots of numbers, but 1.94 is enough. Now, when we look at something like that, these are the results in Pennsylvania for that poll. Trump at 46, Biden at 48. And you might say, oh, the difference is greater than 1.94, and so therefore I'm comfortable with this poll. But that's not the way it works. If you look at the AP style book, for example, they give you a rough guideline. You have to double the sampling error. So the difference has to be more than twice the sampling error for us to talk about it. The way that this works, each one of these is its own sample. And if you remember the normal curve, for example, all it's telling us is most likely it's in the middle of that curve, but the curve goes out, and so there's a lower percentage of it being as low as 44, there's a lower percentage of it being as high as 48. We apply that to both samples and we see that there's overlap. And so what we want to do is, normally when we report poll results, we're reporting them at a confidence level. We're confident of them at about 95%. Okay, that's the norm. That still means that 1 out of every 20 polls is just going to be off because of sampling error. Whoops, we got a bad sample. And when you think of sampling, just think of that old thing from elementary school. You have black and white marbles in a jar, and you dip your hand in and you grab a sample. How accurate can you be in predicting the split of marbles in the jar? And that depends on a lot of different things. The thing with sampling error to remember is apply sampling error to both of the numbers, not just to one. And that goes for things like, yes, when you have 2 candidates, but also if there's a change in the polls. If you say Trump rose or Biden rose in the polls, if they rose by 1 point, that's not really a rise. That's statistically insignificant. It's basically the same number as it was before. Yes, in the poll it was a rise, but it's not that accurate. I mean, it exceeds our ability to be accurate in the polls. Same thing with records. I see a lot of people reporting like, oh, this is the highest that Trump's ever been or the lowest that Trump's ever been. Either of those, you're usually talking about a difference of a point. And if this is the highest that Trump's been by a point, it's not that real of a difference. One of the downsides of this is it makes reporting on polls much more boring. It's very hard to get a story. And one of the things I often tell people is if you think you have an exciting poll, it's probably not a good poll. If a poll shows a major difference, there's probably something wrong with it. You don't want to really go overboard on reporting any single poll. Polls are about trends. The other thing with these is when you're looking at polls, you really want to get used to saying it's around here. If you ever hear Nate Silver talk about polls, well, it looks like Biden's up by 8 points in the poll, but he'll go, well, it looks like Biden's up, and he doesn't discuss the numbers that much because he realizes the numbers are fuzzy. As I said earlier, national polls, election polls tend to be off by about 2% on average. Sometimes they're much worse than that. Occasionally they're better, but on average, they're about 2% off. This is the way that we as journalists frequently want to see poll results. We hear a poll result, we hear a number, and we look at that little number and we go, oh, that's nice. That's the number. We draw lines and it becomes even clearer. We can track things going over time. This is the way you really should be looking at those numbers. They're like fuzzy blobs. It's around this, ballpark. And in fact, this is from the 2016 election, the last 2 weeks. If you look at the last poll, there's a whole heck of a lot of overlap there. And I remember driving to work the morning of the election and listening to somebody on talk radio saying the New York Rangers have a better chance of losing to the New York Giants on the ice than Hillary has a chance of losing during the poll. And I remember thinking at the time, that's just a ludicrous statement. The smart money at the time was on Hillary Clinton, but there certainly was not a 0% chance that she was going to lose. I remember Nate Silver gave it a 35% chance of her losing, and everybody jumped on him as though this was sort of a bad thing. Just looking at the polls, you can see there's a whole heck of a lot of overlap. If I had a bet, I would have bet on Hillary, but I wouldn't have bet because I wasn't that confident about things. Now, another tip for handling polls, remember the premise of the polls. Whenever you're getting a poll, you're going to hear something like during the polling question, if the election were held today. Guess what? The election isn't held today. So therefore, the poll is only marginally useful. Polls right now, they're nice to talk about and they're kind of fun at times, but they're not going to predict the election. We saw that in the last election. We see that in a lot of elections. Even in this election where Biden is holding a pretty steady lead, there's a lot of game to be played yet, particularly debates if and when they occur. It also says, how would you vote? You also want to think about who are they polling? Are they polling everybody? In which case, it's not a terribly good poll because most people aren't going to vote. Are they going to poll registered voters? Okay, well, that's a better chance, but it's still not perfect. What we want to look for are polls that poll likely voters. LV, it's usually listed as opposed to RV. The downside with that is we then have to figure out how do we determine whether or not you're a likely voter. And we saw during President Obama's election, we tended to underestimate the ability of young people to vote, for example. If we have reason to believe people are going to the polls in a way that's different than they've gone in the past, that sort of tweaks those polling numbers a little bit of likely voters. We also say if the candidates, and if you look at the questions on most of these polls, this is what they say: if the candidates were Democrat Joe Biden and Republican Donald Trump, they might flip-flop them, but the order might matter, and also the fact that there are more than 2 candidates in the race is going to matter. It's going to throw the numbers off just a little bit. If you don't answer it, they try to force you. If you had to vote for one of those candidates, who would you vote for? Again, that's going to skew those numbers just a little bit. And I'm not saying that as anything against pollsters. They do an amazing job with this. I'm always surprised by how good the results are. Main tip for everybody is really just think. Warren Buffett said a public opinion poll is no substitute for thought. Don't get all caught up in the polls. I remember at the last election in, I believe it was October. So we have the Bloomsburg Fair in northeastern Pennsylvania. We get a couple of 100,000 people going to the fair. I remember driving to the fair and not passing a single Hillary Clinton sign. All I passed the whole way. Now, you might expect that in the country, but that was the city as well. I saw one Hillary Clinton sign. I said, oh, there's a Clinton sign, and it said Hillary for jail or something like that. So, and walking through the fair, there was an awful lot of sentiment for Trump and not much for Clinton. I had earlier in the spring, I had a couple of Swedish students in my class, and they asked me if I thought Trump had a chance of winning, and I said I thought he did. Because if he could take Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, traditionally blue areas, he could swing the state of Pennsylvania. And I felt if he swung the state of Pennsylvania, there was a chance he could win the election. They were shocked by that. But I said, again, you have to look at everything. You have to look at the big picture. You know, the old trope of Pennsylvania is Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Alabama in the middle. Everybody forgets about Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, as well as other areas being traditionally blue. But I think Luzerne County is still tilting red. Lackawanna went blue last time. I think they'll go blue again. Biden's hometown, if you want to think of it that way. But I'm still not sure about Luzerne County. A couple of quick additional tips. I have maybe 1 minute left. Know your polling organization. Somebody had asked a question about that. You can go to something like 538.com, you can go to Pew Research, and they will list the polling organizations that are good versus those that are bad. Some polling organizations just make up data. They usually go out of business fairly quickly when they do that. Some polling organizations tend to tilt right, like Rasmussen, for example, just in the way that they draw their poll, the way that they skew their poll. They're not trying to be right-wing about it. It's just the way their poll goes. Some skew left, and you just want to know that. It's one of the problems with comparing like a Rasmussen poll to an NBC poll, for example. You want to compare polls within. Be careful with outliers. As I said, if somebody is, if a poll is really out of whack, there's probably something wrong with it. Avoid blaming the results on today's news. So a lot of times people will say, oh, well, because of what's happening with this is why the poll is different. You run into a lot of problems with that. We do that with the Dow as well. Again, comparing separate polls is dangerous. Don't overthink them. It's pretty straightforward. And again, just be a little fuzzy when you're reporting on them. Polls evolve over time. These little dots are not all that meaningful. If you like the poll results, be especially questioning of them, because we tend to look at a poll result, it makes sense, and we want to run with it. Avoid that trap. The other thing, Republicans typically underpoll, and Trump underpolls more than most Republicans. It's very difficult for somebody to admit to liking Trump, particularly when the national media are seen as being anti-Trump. If NBC calls you and says, who are you going to vote for, you're less likely to be honest about it. I think they called it the shy Trump voters in the last election, but it's going to be an even bigger problem this time around. I would add at least 2 points to any results for Trump. You may run into the same issues on local elections as well, knowing what was going on. When I lived in Louisiana, David Duke, for example, you knew David Duke was going to put out results much higher than his poll ratings. So that's it for now. I tried to get through everything I could in 15 minutes. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions at the end, I assume.
Thank you, Matt. All right.
Sorry for the wall of words.
No worries. I'm just trying to get Brad set up here. Brad, are you able to talk with us? Seem to be having some audio issue. All right, Brad, are you able to disconnect and reconnect? Okay. In the interim, we'll have Bernie Oravec go while we get you reconnected. Bernie, we're not hearing you. So if you can check and see if you have something muted. Look, it's a small microphone and it may look red with a slash through it.
Okay, let's give it a shot now.
There we go. Thank you, Bernie.
Okay, I think we're okay to go, correct?
Yes.
My portion will be managing and marketing your newspaper while covering the 2020 election. A few ways to maintain and strengthen community credibility as the go-to source for all election information. Next. Navigating an election in the age of COVID. Most of my slides are basically talking points for you to think about later on, so I'll be jumping around a little bit on each slide. I think the first thing we all have to keep in mind is to accept the fact that this year will be unlike anything we've dealt with in the past. Dealing with the virus, dealing with civil unrest, mail-in ballot issues, late results, probably many more contested results than in the past, changes or accessibility issues with voting locations, in many cases, limited candidate access. So it's going to be an extremely pressing time for all of us to get this information in as best we can. Of course, your newspaper will be the main historical record of the election, so you have to treat it as though your reputation depends on it. We have to cut through all the haze and rise above the noise and confusion. That's my little shout out to Kansas there. So the first thing we're going to talk about is meeting the candidates. In the primary, typically you want to have the candidate photo and profiles as announcements are made so that everybody knows who's running in your community. We're well past that. At this point, you can still get involved in weekly question and answer sessions with the candidates on specific issues. In the past, some of the papers I've been involved with have done 4 to 6 of these over the course of a 4 to 6 week period. You'd ask a question, for example, to both candidates on their position on affordable housing. And then the following Sunday, there might be an article where they're both talking about gun regulations. And then maybe we'll have an economic discussion. But the point is you're keeping both candidates, you're giving them both equal time, equal space on a 4 to 6 week basis where you're keeping the election and the topics front and center for all your readers. One of the things we've also done in the past is publish a voter's guide a few weeks before the election basically recapping the candidates' positions and profiles. This would be especially true if you're having a lot of local elections, county offices, school boards, city councils, boroughs and townships, things of that nature, where typically you don't have a chance to read much about what some of these candidates are thinking. Of course, in this year where we're dominated with the presidential election, which of course is going to take center stage, you still may have an opportunity to promote some of these other elections in your marketplace. Typically, pre-COVID, many of us would sponsor debates and forums where the public can come and just sit and watch or ask questions. We know that's not going to happen very often now. So it's just as important if you have the opportunity, again, this will be more for state level on down, to have some kind of a virtual debate or candidates forum. Often you can partner with other local media, whether it be radio, cable television, and don't be afraid to show your banner or your masthead. I mean, you know, you are the go-to source in your community. Let them know that you're involved with this debate. Try and have an impartial questioner, whether it's a president of a chamber of commerce or the NAACP or a school district, whatever it might be. Have some community leaders act as moderators and questioners for the debate, and I think you'll get a lot of really good feedback on this. Plus, it does a great service to the community. I'm going to just touch on this briefly. I know most of you, I believe, are editors and publishers and so forth, reporters, but I do want to touch on paid political advertising because God knows we all need it. Of course, all paid political advertising should be in advance. All rates and discounts must be offered to all candidates. Don't give the Democrat 25% off and the Republican 10% off. It has to be equal across the board, or you can catch hell for that later. All ads should have some sort of disclaimer on the bottom, clearly stating who paid for the ad. The reason for this is what I'm going to talk about next, that we are not the fact police when it comes to paid advertising. Do not spend your time fact-checking political ad content. That's not what we're there for. We're either going to accept or reject an ad in general, because the people who actually pay for the ad, who are on that disclaimer, ultimately hold the responsibility for that ad. Now, if that ad is coming back with, you know, racist slurs or excessive use of the F word, which probably wouldn't occur, but if something really crazy like that happens, you just refuse the ad. Don't go back and ask them to edit it out, because then you're getting involved in editing their political opinions, their freedom of speech. Just say yes or no on the ad, and it protects you and does your readers the best service. Of course, at no time should you share an opponent's ad schedule or content with anyone. You know, if one salesperson is being asked, hey, what's my opponent doing? You can't say, well, they're doing 3 half pages and a quarter page. Don't do it. Just say yes or no, they're advertising or they're not, and leave it at that. And of course, if the opportunity arises and if you have the staff, which is always tough in this day and age, try and designate a specific sales rep, possibly a senior sales rep, to handle all the candidates, if possible. And the reason for this is if there's one person handling all the Democrats, all the Republicans, all the independents, not only are they going to get a greater knowledge of how the political process works and how political advertising works, but you can simply state at that time, look, I'm an independent here. I'm just taking your ads. I'm doing everybody's advertising. So there's no opportunity to play politics within the actual paper itself when it comes to paid political advertising. Not that it happens all the time, but it can. So if you have that luxury to designate one person to handle all the candidates, please try it, and I think you'll be very happy with the results. And editorial pages, here's the nuts and bolts of the presentation. At all times, try and run pro-voting op-eds, champion the process of elections, why people should vote, why it's important, what turnout's been over the years in your particular region. Promote the fact that voting counts and is important. In this day and age, you want to explain mail-in voting and changes in polling locations if at all possible. Of course, you want to also do this in your regular news section of the paper with regular daily news, but also bring it up in the editorial pages in combination with how you're trying to promote voting as a whole. Here's something that people have different views on. This is simply my view. It's not right or wrong. It's just the Bernie method, if you will, when dealing with letters to the editor. Years ago, when people wrote letters to the editors, they were written and designed by their own hand and their own thought process. Today, there are so many canned political letters out there. Political parties will go to their supporters, they'll give them 3 templates to use, and they'll tell them to inundate every newspaper and media market in the area. So what you run into is the same old thing over and over, day after day, coming from the political candidates and their machinery. Our view on this is we will accept letters. We're not going to tell you we won't run them, but about 2 weeks prior to the election, we're going to stop accepting political issues, especially those, or I should say political letters to the editor, especially those dealing with candidates. And the reason for that is when you're that close to the election, it's very difficult for an opponent to react, and you could be giving an unfair advantage to one side or the other by allowing the free letters to the editor that close to an election. You can still continue to accept letters on specific issues, but I would avoid anything that's saying, here's why I like or dislike a particular candidate. Another hot topic these days is dealing with social media comments and commentary on website stories. A lot of folks have a different philosophy on this. Some think anything goes. Whatever's written on the social media is fair game. We are publishers. We're not necessarily platforms. So from that standpoint, if you find that there are things, especially dealing with, again, racial commentary, excessive use of the F word, we have been known to take those down. We don't look at any of the other contact or opinion. We're just looking strictly if it's using some excessively terrible language that would offend a large segment of our readership. We would actually take that down. Know your reader base, know what they like to read, know their political backgrounds. If you're in a heavily Democratic area, you're not going to bombard your editorial pages with pro-Trump stories. If you're in a pro-conservative area, you want to be fair and not bombard your readers with all AP canned editorials. So there's ways of trying to spread this out. You want your paper, your news volume, to be as fair and balanced as possible. What's in the actual newspapers? Of course, on your editorial pages, you can say and do whatever you wish, because that's when you can actually get your opinion out there. And most of your readers, by and large, understand that. They understand that you try and be fair in your news pages, but on that editorial page, you're going to go one way or the other, and they kind of expect that, I think, day in and day out. Which leads us to the big question, which is endorsements. I don't believe there's a right or wrong answer on this. I think it depends on what your management and ownership philosophy is. In my world, I would try and personally stay away from local endorsements for things like school boards, city councils, township supervisors, things of that nature, where there really, at the end of the day, is not a huge difference in the candidates. One might be a Democrat, one might be a Republican, they might have a few different viewpoints, but by and large, on some of the municipal type elections, you don't have the kind of difference in candidate as you would possibly on the state or national level. When it comes to state level or higher county level, or if you're in a bigger city, if you're in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, you have big mayor races, things of that nature, I think you endorse, but only after meeting with and talking with both of the candidates. You have to have a very fair and balanced approach before you endorse, because whoever you endorse is going to come back at you one way or the other, whether they win or lose, whether they're happy with the endorsement or not. You've got to be able to defend that in a fair way, which is basically saying that, look, I talked to both sides, here's where we're at. You should try, depending on what your philosophy is of the paper, try, if you do end up doing an endorsement, you want to try and match your opinion page history. It's kind of odd to, for example, have generally a conservative paper, then all of a sudden you're going to pick out a candidate from the other side, which doesn't balance right with your readers. It really comes down to personal preference on endorsements. I tend to stay away from them. Early on in my career as a young publisher, I got talked into doing some endorsements by my editor and local news editor. for a mayoral race, which probably wasn't the smartest thing to do. So going forward, really think about it, talk about it with your editorial board, and when you do make a choice, base it on who you think the best candidate is. In other words, who should win, as opposed to who actually is going to win. I mean, you really have to base it on some type of a belief system. And of all the things we're going to talk about, and of all the things you're going to be faced with as an editorial board, probably the endorsements is going to be the most cause of your sleep, any of your sleep loss. So take it very seriously, and only do it if you really think you need to, and it's going to make a difference. Finally, and trying to wrap up quickly here, when it comes to editorials, I've always been a fan of editorials on issues rather than actual candidates, although both are highly acceptable. Understand that social media, especially Twitter, is not representative of America or your community. I think that's a big misconception now with the national media. Every tweet that they read, they think is supported by 75% of the American people, and that's not the case. Twitter is a very small population of users, but unfortunately they have the loudest voice. And don't get caught in the trap where you're going to just go along with whatever you're hearing or seeing on Twitter. The next part is probably obvious to all of you, no matter what side of the political election or political presidential election you fall on. The coverage, of course, can be very heated and seem irrational at times. AP coverage, as we all know, is extremely left-leaning these days. Whether you support it or not, that's just the way it is. Know when you're writing editorials, not everybody hates the current president, just like everybody didn't hate prior presidents. I mean, it's, don't go by the loudest voice. Go by what your community is best for your community and what represents them. Just be aware of this when choosing supplied editorials, so you're not caught in that trap of all of a sudden you're taking one side, which maybe wasn't your plan. And finally, just to wrap things up on election night and beyond, prepare your readers well in advance for the honest and real possibility of results will not be available next day, especially on the presidential side. Continue the public results as you receive them, both in print and online. Direct your readers to check your website for up-to-date results, and please have somebody responsible for refreshing these as they come in from the county or city or whomever you're getting them from. It's always good to have discussions with some voters about their experiences. That's a great post-election piece. Pursue any mail-in ballot reconciliation. In other words, if you're finding out in your community that X amount of mail-in ballots either still haven't been counted or accounted for, definitely follow up on that. Keep pressure on your local board of electors at all times, because you're really the only people that can do it. The newspaper is really one of the last vestiges of a watchdog out there to keep these folks honest. Of course, not on here, but very important, election ballot selfies. People who like to take a selfie in the voting box with their completed ballot. Generally, most states frown on it. Pennsylvania, it was illegal up until 2016. In 16, they basically worded a document that said it's permitted as long as you don't post it until you're outside the polling place. As a news media organization, we are not allowed to take pictures like that of somebody with their ballot. Of course, we're not in the actual voting booths. But if somebody comes out to you and says, look, here's a selfie of me voting for President so-and-so, if you want to run it because it's a great photo, that's fine, but don't do it until after the polls have closed at 8 o'clock. Don't put it online until well after. That is becoming a very strange phenomenon. I mean, it's kind of a freedom of speech issue for the person to say, look, here's who I voted for. But under state law, they really don't want that to be influencing anyone either in the polls or outside. So the general way Pennsylvania approaches it again is, if you do it, they can't stop you as a person from taking a picture of you and your ballot, but they'd rather not have it posted until you leave the premises. And as a newspaper, you probably don't want to post someone else's until after the polls actually close. And if it's permitted, or excuse me, if you received it directly from the original subject, do not use secondhand ballot selfies. I hope that makes sense, because it's a very strange topic. I can't imagine in my 50s going back and take a picture of me voting, but today, if you're under 30, it's all the rage. So that's something you may have to deal with. And then finally, a few things to add interest towards the election. A possible countdown of days remaining to the election, maybe on a small box on page 1. Keep an eye out for endorsement press releases that really should be paid advertisements. We often run into this in our industry with the State Bar Association and folks supporting judges and auditor and attorney generals and so forth, where the judges and the bar will get together and say, well, we give so-and-so a rating of this or a rating of that, and then they expect you to do a half-page story about their endorsement. That, to me, is advertising more than news. You can handle it any way you like. That's just an opinion. Next year, after the nomination petitions have been filed in March, hold a candidates night. I've had a lot of success with this over my short career. What we would do is sometime in March, we'd ask anybody who's a candidate for anything in our readership area to come to the newspaper, for cookies and punch, and spend about an hour and a half where all our main departments will make a quick presentation. Editorial will tell us, well, how do you submit news information? Photography will talk about photos. Advertising will talk about what you do to get an ad in the paper, and have some handouts to show how they can best communicate with you, which not only makes the process fairer for the candidate, but we all know it makes our lives a lot easier in the editorial department and the advertising department if the candidates understand the process. In the end, basically stay true to who you are. Your newspaper, as all newspapers, have always been a valuable part of your community for many years. Your coverage is the permanent record. Whether it's in print or online, more people are reading newspaper products than ever before. Our folks in circulation won't agree with that, but when it comes to actual information being disseminated, we have a pretty good readership out there due to the online components and how things are being shared with social media. So really try your best to get it right. Try and put your best people on the beat. If you have rookies, try and have them come back and talk to your editors as much as possible to get everything right. And when it comes to endorsing, that really comes down to what your philosophy is editorially, but make sure you don't allow your reporters to be involved in that process in any way. You don't want reporters endorsing or supporting candidates either in your publication or on social media. Have that talk with your reporters. It should just be the editorial board and the publisher who make that decision. So hopefully this gives you a general idea of ways to continue to promote your paper, to be a go-to source for election information. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me anytime. Again, some of the things I shared were strictly personal opinion. There's no real handbook on this. It's just from 30 some years in the newspaper business and about 12 or 13 as a publisher. So just take what take some, leave some. But if there's anything I can do to help you, please contact me. Thank you very much.
All right, Brad, do you want to try again?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks for the opportunity to address this group. Again, my name is Brad Bumsted. I've been a reporter for more than 4 decades, which gives you a little indication of my age. And I've been with Gannett, most of it with Gannett News Service, and worked in Florida and Washington, D.C., and about 18 years with the Pittsburgh Trib, and more recently with LNP Media Group for the Caucus, where we focus on investigative stories. But I've covered elections and can answer a lot of your questions. I've covered from the courthouse to the state house, from county commissioner races to congressional races, U.S. Senate races, and I've done my share of presidential visits and various things you would do with presidential candidates. So just give you some ideas. If you're on the street and you're trying to get community voices for use in your story, and you walk up to somebody and you interview them, and this person gives you a great quote, I think they're all bums, we ought to throw them out. and you get the requisite age and general address where they're from and maybe a little bit of background on them, and you walk off and you think you've got what you need there. Well, you really don't, because the key question you forgot to ask is, are you a registered voter? Loosely, people are called voters, even in polls where they're not registered, so they can't vote unless they make a special effort to do it at that point. And that's something you should always look for in poll results. When you look at who the poll was talking to, was it voters or was it registered voters or was it likely voters? Even better. And Matt did such a great job on talking about polling that I'm only a couple places in a supplemental way augmenting what he had. The other thing is candidates polls. You'll frequently run into, especially at a legislative race or something like that, where the candidate is saying, well, our polls show we're 10 points ahead. Well, that's meaningless, of course. You know, you don't write a story about that, even if the person says, well, I'll give you the poll, and they just give you a little summary of their 10-point lead. You need to see the whole poll. How was it put together? What was the margin of error? What was the sample for that poll? You have to be very wary of ever using something like that. Just something to keep in mind. The coverage of races doesn't matter whether it's for city council or legislature. I believe should be thematic and issue based, not horse race. You know, who's got the most money? Who's ahead in the polls? You know, that's there'll be some element of that because people want to know it if you can in an objective way through independent polls, like something that Matt is doing. But by and large, you know, try to focus on 2 or 3 of the key issues in the community, which you can identify by talking to voters. Another tack you can use to get a wider swath of candidates for stories is to do your own survey. You don't have to wait till the League of Women Voters does one. You know, they do one that most papers will use, but the questions may not be exactly what you want. They might not get to the key questions that are important in your community. And you have to limit the number of words ahead of time. Tell people, look, you know, we can't use more than 200 words on this, or they'll write 2,000 words on it. But it's a good way to have, you know, a base for your coverage where you then have in writing what these people said they supported and they didn't support, especially if they're elected and then they don't do it. You've got something in writing as well. The best advice I have in terms of covering races and to be the go-to source is to read. May sound simplistic, but it's not. I don't mean just read the clips in your library about this particular race. I mean, if you're on the political beat for a month or two, which at most small papers is about what it amounts to, you're not going to be doing it full time. Read everything you can in your spare time about all the races from the top down, from the presidential race. Read Politico, you know, read places you can where you don't need have to get past a paywall, and just try to get a sense of where your local races fit in nationally. And I think that's probably the most important thing you can do. Probably, I guess that's true as a reporter too, that you need to do that. Another thing, given the mayhem that could result after this election, especially, you know, the presidential level, where we may not know who won. We may not know for weeks. Some of this, you know, you could look back and look what was reported, you know, in the Bush-Gore race until the U.S. Supreme Court decided it. You had your hanging chads in Florida, and there was just all this confusion about who had won. You know, keep in mind that election night that could happen, and it could happen in down ballot races as well. So one of our questions that we dealt with here was about calling a race. You shouldn't be calling any races generally, and especially not now in this environment. You could say, oh, but we know this person was up 10-1 or whatever. No, you just report, especially for the morning edition, that in unofficial election returns, because they are unofficial at that point, so and so was leading so and so by X% of the vote, not who the winner is. If someone concedes, you go to that and report that as a big indicator in the race, but generally not calling them, because it's just going to get you in a world of trouble. I saw 2 races over the years that AP called 2 races in an auditor general and an attorney general's race based on the numbers that came out of Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and it just like these were overwhelming. The Democrat was going to win. Well, what they didn't take into account was the Republican counties, the so-called T in Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania, up through the counties along the northern tier, came in so overwhelming for the Republican candidates that the Republican won. In one case, the wrong winner had been declared. So the same thing can happen locally, and you just want to be really cautious with that and just go with what the results show at press time. That's really all I have to say at the moment. And if you have other questions, I'd be glad to answer them. And you can reach me at bbumsted, BBUMSTED, no A, at caucuspa.com.
Thank you, Brad. All right, so now we're going to move into the question and answer aspect of the webinar. And we actually just received a question from John, and he was asking, why do you feel that there wouldn't be debates? If you want to go into that, while we may know the general answer, just exploring that a little bit more, what debates may look like and how to handle them.
You mean as a reporter, how to handle them?
I think he's saying in general. So I think that it was Matt who spoke about that. So if he wants to speak about it first, and then I'll let you, Brad, and then Bernie go.
Yeah, I mentioned it. There has been some discussion, particularly on the Democratic side, about whether debates are appropriate, particularly with, and if so, how they're going to be conducted. Are the candidates going to be in separate locations? Are they going to be in a similar location? How many debates should there be? I personally don't see how you can get away with not having debates. I think it would be bad for democracy not to have debates, but there is still negotiation going on about that. I personally think they're going to be held, but it's going to be a very unusual situation. I don't know. There's no reason the 2 candidates could not be on the same stage, not with an audience. I certainly hope that's the way that it comes out, as opposed to separate rooms and separate locations, because even that's going to lead to a lot of controversy. I'm very curious to see how it develops and how many debates they're going to have. I would expect 3. Wouldn't surprise me if they can't negotiate a number that high for whatever reason. So. And all I know on that is what I'm reading in the news.
Brad, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I guess I would add to that, whether it's a local race for the state house or a presidential race, which you wouldn't really be involved in setting up or covering. But just keep in mind, if you cover a debate and have to write a story about it, that a debate in 90% of the cases is not really a debate. It's not a back and forth. It's basically, canned lines that a candidate won't even answer the question that was asked. He's going to say what he or she wants to say at that point, and you don't have a lot of time if you're on the panel to call them on it and say, but you didn't answer the question. Could you, please answer? That's what you would do if there were time, and you can try to do it, but chances are you're not. And it's one spin comment after another, and you have to try to cut through all of that and say, what did they really say? And if you have follow-up, that's the most important part. But in a half-hour debate, there's not going to be much chance for that, and it's really difficult to get out of that what it is they really think. You might get a sense of who they are, and if it's televised, people would get a sense for whether they like them or not. But as far as details and what they stand for, it's very difficult.
Bernie, would you like to comment at all?
Yeah, I would agree well with both what Matt and Brad said. I do think there are going to be presidential debates. You're probably going to have them well socially distanced, masked or without, however it goes. I think you're going to have the two men somewhere together on a stage, far apart, and then whatever the panel is. So you will see the presidentials. I think on a local level, it's much tougher unless you can arrange something on again, whether a Google or a Zoom type online debate, or possibly, again, if it's only a two-person race on opposite sides of a school auditorium. I think there's opportunities there on the local and county level. But at this point, I don't know, how much time remains to set something like that up. But I do see it happening on a presidential level. I'd be surprised if there weren't a minimum of two, at the very least.
Thank you. We have a question for Brad. With your long history of covering politics, what was the biggest mistake you ever saw in reporting, and what should our industry learn from it?
I think, I referred to the biggest mistake I saw in reporting of elections, and that was AP, and no disrespect intended to the AP. They do good work. But, it's late night, it's 2 o'clock. They call a race, not counting the late results that are going to be still coming in from Republican areas, and pick the wrong person. I guess that's like declaring Dewey the winner in a presidential race. I mean, that was bad, and that's probably the worst mistake I've seen. I guess the other is some debates that I've seen that were set up in such a way that, as I described them to you as being, spin fests, they're even worse than that. And, because of the forum, there's only a very brief answer given, and there's really no chance for response. And the other candidate moves on to something else. It's just really, a shame that you'd be better off if you had one question and let them really talk, make them talk in depth about it. I mean, I'm not advocating that, but it's just really hard. There are mistakes made all the time in the forum of how these debates are set up.
Okay, thank you. And actually that lends to another question that we received, which is concerning interviewing candidates and their team and staff. Do you have suggestions, gentlemen, on the best ways to interview, the most important questions if you're limited on the time that you're given with these people? And if you have any tips for remote work via phone or Zoom or GoTo. Bernie, you want to start on that?
Well, I think that the first thing comes to mind is make sure you're consistent and both sides get the same questions. I think sometimes a mistake we can make as newspapers is we're zoomed in on a certain candidate stance, and we don't realize that we need to ask both sides the exact same thing. Other than that, I'd leave that up to the reporting pros to cover. Matt and Brad.
Matt, would you like to go?
Well, I would say in terms of interviewing people remotely, don't assume everybody has access to Zoom or a webcam or anything like that. We still use phones. They work really well. I mean, if you can get somebody on Zoom, that's great, because that gives you a little bit more. I like to see the reaction of people. I like to record it if possible. But there's nothing wrong with phone interviews if that's the way it needs to be. Or you can do a socially distanced in-person interview, especially if you're outdoors. I mean, reporters on the ground are dealing with this right now. I don't think there's anything necessarily different about it when it comes to politics. I agree that both candidates should have the same or very similar questions. It might not work it probably would. I mean, whatever the issues are involved in your community, both candidates are going to have positions on those, and I think it's entirely appropriate to hit them and to keep hitting them until they give you an answer, both sides, whatever that might happen to be. I'm just a firm believer in that, and I'm old school. I like Bernie. I've been doing this for 40 years. I started in 1980, so I mean, I haven't done it like Bernie has the whole way through, but I have done it for a while. And yeah, I mean, the things that I believe in playing it down the middle and trying to offer up facts. I'd encourage everybody to stay away from adjectives. That seems to be always the pitfall, to declare a winner in a debate, except on the editorial page. To say that somebody got a gotcha or a good or anything like that, I'd encourage staying away from all of that. I mean, I've been accused of bias because I ran one candidate's photo a little bit bigger than the other one, and I only did that because it made the page layout better. And I can't remember what party they were accusing me of being in, and they were two candidates for school board who run on both sides. They run as Democrats and Republicans, so you will be accused of it. Just try to do the best that you can.
I've never declared a winner in a debate, haven't written a story like that, but I'll just give you the other side of it. One time when I worked down in Florida for Gannett News Service, I was covering a U.S. Senate debate and was walking out with a really good and excellent political reporter for the Miami Herald. And I said, hey, what are you going to go with on this? He says, I'm going to go with, Bob Graham won the debate. And I said, how do you, he goes, that's my job. It's my job is to tell people who won, how they did, and why they won. I get that. I personally wouldn't do it, but he made a point. And it's well taken. I think as far as interviews is really what we're talking about here. My approach to it is no different for an election story that you're interviewing for or some other interview, and that is to get what you need first. If there are going to be some contentious questions as you go down the line and have to push the candidate that, no, come on, answer this, you still haven't answered it, they may get pissed off and want to hurry out of the interview. So get what you need up front, even if those are softer questions or things that you gather the material you need, and then get into the watching the time, of course, so you don't run out of time to ask the tough questions, but then you can push and push away.
If I can piggyback on Brad for 1 second too, in addition to those easy questions, another trick is to ask a lot of questions where you're going to expect a yes response. And if you get the interviewee saying yes, 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 the rest of the interview tends to go a bit more smoothly, just psychologically. But you're absolutely right. The easy questions first. There are some people who differ, but I agree with you. The easy questions first, and the ones where they might stop the interview later.
Very helpful, thank you. We had a question come in on chat. The question is, how much, if at all, should election coverage be reconfigured with Pennsylvania's expanded mail-in voting? So let's go with Brad first.
How much should it be reconfigured?
Yeah, I think redesigning the distribution of the coverage, given that it may, be a different time period than we may have been used to in more recent elections.
I don't know any, magic bullet in that. It's the more time you can get ahead of the election to get this underway is probably the most important part. And, so I guess the other part would be training for local elected officials, so they have a way of dealing with this and a way to deal with so many that come in ahead of time and have those results compiled. But it's a great question, but I'm sorry, I just don't know the magic bullet for this. So,
Bernie, would you like to weigh in?
I'll try. I think the way I'd approach it, because of all the mail-in balloting and the early voting, typically as newspapers, we hold a lot of our heavier political coverage till about October 15th, October 10th and on. I think I would just push the timetable up to September. In other words, instead of waiting till 3 weeks before the election to talk about the heavier details and the bigger interviews, I try and get as much of that in as you can right now, just as a service to the people who are going to be voting by mail. I also think a lot of people, whatever side of the fence they're on, I think a lot of people already have an idea of which direction they're leaning. I think what it's going to come down to is what happens nationally with debates, and if something really strange happens out there, either, politically, militarily, economically. But for the most part, I think what you're trying to do is get the information out now to everyone. I don't know how many minds it's going to make up, but I think it would be in our best interest just to be part of the process earlier than normal.
Think about that with polling too, because a poll, even if the last minute poll says something, you have to realize a certain number of people have already voted every year. This year it may be more than normal. One of the things I'm not seeing is, the mail-in voting is a story in and of itself. And one of the things I'm not seeing is people distinguishing what's different about mail-in voting this year versus absentee voting, which we've always had. Some explanatory pieces for people that are not following politics very closely. The fact is, research shows that the people who follow politics closely have already made up their minds. So the people that you're writing stories for right now basically have made up their minds if they're reading the news. The people who have not made up their minds, those undecided voters, they'll check in sometime after Labor Day, and they will start making up their minds closer and closer to election, but they may not make up their minds till the last couple of weeks, unless they vote in advance. But the mail-in is going to be a story, I think, in and of itself, and I think it's going to require continued coverage, and as Bernie said, preparation for everybody to say that the more mail-in ballots there are, the more information we can get about that, the more likely it's going to take a while till we get a result, both, as you said, both in national and in local elections.
Okay. Thank you very much. If anyone has any last minute questions, please do feel free to post those in the chat. Otherwise, I want to thank all of you for participating today. Thank you to our speakers, Matt, Brad, and Bernie. We greatly appreciate your time and your expertise. And thank you again. We'll be sending some follow-up communication. So if you have any questions of the information from the speakers that you'd like to see in that follow-up communication, please do feel free to just send me a little request. You can either do so in the chat, or I am going to actually post my information so you can contact me, and you can take a look at the additional webinars that are coming up. I invite you to explore all of those. We have several more sessions in the next coming months, and we also have some sessions that were previously recorded. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a lovely weekend.
You too.
Thank you.